This encounter started our next guest on what she calls an obsessive quest to discover more about her family roots. Elizabeth Thalhimer Smartt spent years compiling her genealogical history, which became the basis of this new book. It's called Finding Thalhimers. It's an insider's perspective of the 150-year story of the family and their beloved department store. Good morning, Elizabeth. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You brought a friend with you, Snow Bear.
Yeah, I've got my little friend.
Anybody who shopped at Thalhimer's knows Snow Bear.
Yes, yeah. This was my personal Snow Bear, actually. So he and I go way back.
Now, this is a wonderful story, and it's amazing because whether you were a fan of Thalhimer's, you love Richmond history, or you want to know something about finding your family history, there's something for everyone in this book.
Yeah, I wrote it to be not just sort of a walk down memory lane, but also just a tribute to my family. You know, they spent 5 generations building this business, devoting their whole lives and their, you know, they always talked about honesty, integrity, and service and quality, and I tried to take all of those values and put them into the telling of this story. And I did write it so that it would be interesting whether or not you know Thalhimers. It's a sort of snapshot of an American retail family.
It was a chance meeting with a semi-distant relative that started you down this whole path. Tell us about that.
It was actually the summer before my senior year of college, and I was headed off to film school at NYU. I wasn't interested in my genealogy at all. I thought that was kind of nerdy, but my dad took me to stay with a distant cousin. Her name was Virginia, but I didn't know why, and it turned out it was because she was a Thalhimer relative. She was born in Virginia and ended up in New York. She had a family album that was actually mentioned the first Thalhimer, so I found the first Thalhimer and wrote this book starting from there.
It's interesting how that search goes on because the first Thalhimer really wasn't named Thalhimer.
No, actually he chose the name Thalhimer. It was back in 1809 when an edict of Napoleon in Germany said that Jews were allowed to choose their last names. So he chose the name Thalhimer, meaning home in the valley. And I actually had an opportunity to go visit that valley, which was a phenomenal and very poignant experience for me.
There's a lot of emotional stories in here of your family, which is kind of nice because a lot of people did shop at Thalhimer's, and for a lot of people it was just the name of a store.
Sure.
And there's some recent history in here as well because you talk about the sit-ins that happened 50 years ago, over 50 years ago at Thalhimer's, and how it brought you together with someone.
Yes, yeah, that was a very special story. My grandfather always talked about, you know, the civil rights era and the turbulent times at Thalhimer's, but then also his opportunity to visit with President Kennedy and become sort of a model for other retailers that were about to integrate. But I got to meet one of the original sit-in protesters at a reunion of the protesters and a protest sort of commemoration back in 2002, I think. And Liz Rice and I got to be great friends, and she called me the other day. We keep in touch, and it's become a very interesting friendship. And the other thing that I noticed about reading the story was how your grandfather and you really bonded through him telling the stories to you to continue this history. Yeah, I interviewed him personally for 4 years, and it was much more than just the sort of granddaughter visiting her grandfather experience. I approached it like an interview, just like this, that I had my questions and really wanted to hear the whole story objectively and not just the little sort of tidbits that you discuss, you know, over Thanksgiving dinner. I wanted to know the true story, and I did become obsessed with it, and I did want to know all the details, and I'm so glad I did that. I really got to know my grandfather in a way that I feel very privileged to have done.
And you brought some memorabilia. A lot of people will remember the black and white checkerboard from Thalhimer's, the boxes that had the sweets and the good things inside of them.
Yeah, the good stuff, exactly.
What was it like for you growing up with the last name Thalhimer in the city of Richmond?
Well, as you can imagine, it was, you know, everyone recognized it, and it was a very blessed way to grow up, really, because Thalhimer's was such a wonderful Richmond institution, and so many people do have stories about it and do recognize it. And all my life, I've grown up hearing those stories. You know, my grandmother worked there, or I worked there, I got my start there, and then, of course, the civil rights stories, which are, I got to know history really firsthand.
You must be very proud of this book. It tells a lot about your family. What's it like putting it all out there for people to read?
It's so scary. I feel very vulnerable having shared something so personal. I worked 12 years on this book, which is a third of my life, and So it's very meaningful to me. I look forward to sharing it with Richmonders. it's very personal, but that's what I wanted it to be. It's an inside story for people, even who think they know Thalhimers. It'll give them a little something that they didn't know before.
It's personal, it's educational, and it's a nice bit of Richmond history. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And you can meet Elizabeth Thalhimer Smartt at her book launch event and reunion this Saturday from 1 to 3 at the Virginia Historical Society on the Boulevard at Kensington. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.